Logan, thanks very much for joining us today. You recently joined Hines. Does that suggest that there's a sort of growing focus on the sector in terms of investment strategy for the firm more generally?
One thing that's interesting about Hines, I think that not a lot of people realize is just how deep and long the Hines track record in logistics industrial really is. Something that I became aware of recently that really caught my attention. In fact, you might find this interesting, is that the first Hines logistics industrial project actually was executed in the year 1957 in the U.S., so well before any of us got involved in this. And since then, the track record of the organization globally covers about 75 million square feet of logistics and industrial assets. And this includes assets acquired, developments under planning across about 11 countries globally. And in Europe specifically, throughout its history, Hines has developed, acquired, and has under planning about 17 million square feet. Again, equally broad geography: UK, Nordics, Germany, Netherlands, Poland, Spain. Substantial assets under management, and already about 25 Hines colleagues working in the logistics industrial sector. So there's already quite a substantial platform to build upon. And at this particular juncture, as logistics real estate increasingly becomes viewed, in addition to, yes, an asset class within institutional real estate, but really also as a part of the critical infrastructure of a city, of an urban environment, it's really only natural that it would increasingly come within the Hines orbit, and that Hines would take an increasing interest in this sector at this point. Because Hines, for me anyway, more than any organization I can think of, has been instrumental in designing cities, in designing urban environments, and designing where people live and work. And from my standpoint, it's a privilege to be invited to play this role in this organization in the European business at this point. So I'm really excited about the opportunity.
And looking at the sector more widely, Logan, there's obviously been the health crisis. How do you see the sort of short-term influences of that versus, I guess, the more sort of longer-term outlook?
For the first month or so of COVID, there was a blip, small blip. And estimates were that customer demand was around about 20%. I saw some figures from the U.S. that suggested that the volume of transactions spanning mid-March to mid-April was down 29%. But even already, even as we're just barely maybe coming out the other side of it, you've already seen this blip go away. I also heard recently that the volume of leasing transactions in the U.S. is in fact 3% higher than 2019. So if there was a blip, if there was a drop, there's an argument that even in the short term, it's already come back. But I think the real story is what the longer term is going to be. The outlook is really quite positive, frankly. And it's mainly due to two reasons. Firstly, COVID has accelerated the penetration of e-commerce substantially. The estimate is that it's accelerated absorption of e-commerce by about 2 to 3 years on average. And e-commerce logistics, e-commerce supply chains require more warehouse space than conventional retail supply chains. So that is projected to substantially increase demand. The second main reason has to do with onshoring and supply chain redundancy as a result of COVID. Now, this was already happening prior to COVID, but again, as with so many things, COVID accelerated it. So now most of the Fortune 500 organizations, most large companies are talking about moving more production closer to the locations where their consumers are. This is expected to increase inventory levels throughout the aggregate supply chain in the range of about 5 to 15%, which in theory should lead to more warehouse space. And there have been several U.S. consultancies that have suggested that this should lead to in the range of an additional 200 million square feet per year of demand for the next several years, which is an extraordinarily high number. To put this in context, this is roughly equivalent to what the annual absorption levels would have been without COVID. So the projections are quite positive relative to what the projections were prior to COVID. And while I personally agree that there's enormous opportunity here and that the sector is entering a really fantastic spot, I nevertheless think it makes sense to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, because these changes, these supply chain adaptations we're talking about, are all happening against the backdrop of a changing economy. And we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. We don't know exactly what the impact of COVID is going to be on logistics and industrial real estate. We think it's going to be strong, but we're not exactly sure what it's going to look like. And when we talk about last mile, I think that's a good example of this. Everyone agrees that last mile is an interesting area to invest right now, but I think there's less consensus on what it is that last mile looks like. And I think that's okay, because there may very well turn out to be several very valid, very positive forms of what it's going to be. So we may not know for a couple more years, and there may be several different right answers. But this in particular is where I believe the deep experience of Hines, and especially the local teams, will really put us in a position to make a difference, because Hines already has the experience of partnering with municipalities, of listening to people who live in these communities and understanding how they want their goods delivered, understanding how they want to get to the office, to the types of environments they want to live in, for example. And this is what Hines has been doing for 50 years already. So it's this same attitude that Hines will be bringing to urban logistics in Europe.
Is your kind of specific view on opportunities, the market, therefore leading you more towards that kind of urban logistics last mile? Or do you see more onshoring and therefore that it's actually across the board for logistics? What's your sense of the opportunities?
I think in many ways the answer is both. I mean, from a broader standpoint, Richard, there's opportunity everywhere. I cannot think of a country or a large metropolitan area where there is not some opportunity in logistics real estate right now. It doesn't mean people can't make bad decisions. It doesn't mean there can't be bad projects, but clearly there's something going on in the sector and it's growing. And most of it will be conventional logistics, big box, potentially XXL, larger e-commerce platforms, the types of platforms that have become increasingly common throughout the industry over the past few years. For sure, those will continue to be very interesting. As well, as you mentioned, last mile or urban infill or last touch. It's called a number of different things by different organizations, but fundamentally the idea is real estate closer to where it can go to people who need goods. Absolutely, there's going to be opportunity there, but I think it's also important that we not be too hasty in jumping to conclusions of what is and is not last mile. There's still technologies emerging. There's still companies operating in this space, not from the real estate standpoint necessarily, but from the logistics and supply chain standpoint, that have the potential to change the way that real estate operates. So from our standpoint, we want to be in a place where we can continue to work with municipalities, with communities, to continue to help them build their urban environment. And irrespective of how the technology of supply chain and urban logistics works out, fundamentally, good locations with buildings that are designed thoughtfully for people who use them from an environmental standpoint and from a social standpoint as well, that make them feel like they want to be in there or pick up their goods there or work there, are always going to be in demand. And it requires a very long-term thoughtfulness and understanding about how cities move and operate, I think, to do this better. So a long way, perhaps, of answering your question, that I think there's opportunities in both areas. It's really a neat time to be in the sector, and we're really quite excited about it.
Well, I look forward to seeing how the strategy evolves at Hines, and always a pleasure to catch up, Logan. Thanks very much.